I think the best way to introduce the theme of this panel is to first recall a purely technical matter of the three factors of production, capital, land and labor. Capital and labor can be easily priced, and land is extremely hard to price, especially when land use changes. Land acquisition in India during the first 4 decades or so of Indian independence was under a Nehruvian planning regime. But land acquisition since 1991, a little later as has been under a market-oriented regime, and that is indeed one of the major thrusts of Michael Levian's book that we have accepted for publication in our series. It's based on precisely this idea that land acquisition under neoliberalism is very different from land acquisition under Nehruvian dirigism. And it has, therefore, a certain political economy, a very different kind of political economy, which needs to be understood. So what we have in the book manuscript is an accumulation of wisdom, insight, and reflection and analysis based on 13 months of intensive field research and then repeated visits to the place called Rajpura. We start with the author. So, Michael, this audience is yours.
Thank you for engaging with this book. Now, I don't need to provide any context in this room about sort of the issue of land acquisition, how explosive it's become in the last few years. I'll just give you this quick graph here, which is the mentions of land acquisition in the times of India over the last 50 or so years. And what you can see is it's peaked quite dramatically since 2007. And while all these debates were happening in the wake of Nandigram and land wars elsewhere that were stalling and scrapping SEZs, I decided to embark on this project, and at the time the debate I thought was, firstly it was largely conjectural, what would be the consequences of SEZs. There was a huge amount of literature on what the consequences of large dams were, for example. But what would be the consequence of these more, post-liberalization projects like SEZs for farmers? There was very little data. Also, I thought the debate was highly polarized between what I would call a modernization theory of dispossession and a predatory theory of dispossession. The modernization perspective, I think, is familiar to everyone. Dispossession is a necessary cost of development. Now, there's one major problem with this perspective is that it doesn't quite distinguish between different kinds of projects. So is a dam or a factory the same as taking land for a Formula One racetrack or a high-end residential colony? And don't these have very different consequences for development? Now, the second perspective is the predatory theory. Now, the problem with this perspective has a similar problem, which is that while some forms of dispossession certainly may be predatory, their predatoriness also surely varies. But the book is really concerned with showing what has changed in the political economy of dispossession post-liberalization. And my archival research in the basements of industrial development corporations and urban development authorities and interviews actually showed that there's quite a dramatic and rapid change that really does start in the 1990s, right? Whereas industrial development corporations start taking land not just for public sector industrial estates, but for hotels, for residential development, for water parks even, and that this kind of culminates in the 2000s with special economic zones, right, which was the kind of to date largest state acquisition for private companies for, as I'll show, pretty strongly real estate driven activities. So what I argue is that under this regime, which I call, when state governments have basically become land broker states, right, in which acquiring land for any kind of private economic purpose, right, becomes a justification for dispossession. Most of the book, however, is concentrated in showing the consequences of this new regime of dispossession for a village that I call Rajpura in Rajasthan, which was one of 9 villages that gave its land for the Mahindra World City, which was one of the largest private SEZs developed in North India. Now, so to evaluate this success, which was touted in the Indian press, this discrepancy between the compensation and market price I actually calculated provisionally and found that the company, by getting this land acquired by the state, was able to resell it to the IT and ITS companies at that time, very early stage of 253% markup. And in the residential component, was going to be at least 1,500% markup using current market values. And that's basically the model of an SEZ developer, right? To get the land acquired by the state and to resell it to companies inside the zone, and then to also develop high-end residential space. Now, the flip side for the village was what we might call disaccumulation of assets. Now, the major contribution of the SEZ to the local economy was an incredible real estate boom. Right? This is a familiar kind of sign that you'll see in a lot of highway front areas or around a big capital project. And it was really a dramatic boom. As this graph shows from the village's land records, there's a huge spike in land transactions. Interestingly, it happens in 2004. The SEZ was announced in 2005. I don't think I need to explain how that happens. But what I did was, in my survey, look at how people's ability to profit from land markets varied across caste and class. The vast majority of the SC and ST households had already sold their plots quickly, cheaply, under economic pressure, many times cheated by brokers from their own village, whereas the upper caste households were largely holding on to those plots. I can't go into much more detail on that, but the main conclusion I reached from this is that I don't have to tell you that IT and IT sectors are the least promising sector to create employment for rural farmers, right? Everyone in these villages marginalized from the jobs created, the core jobs created by this kind of growth. Even the construction jobs, because of the preference for migrant labor, was going entirely to outside workers. A small fraction, 18% of households in my survey got some job for some duration as a security guard, gardener, janitor. These jobs were insecure. They were through contractors. A vast majority of families, ultimately, this was 6 years after land acquisition, reported having less income after the SEZ than before. And same goes for less food, and who subjectively felt that they lost more than they benefited. And my argument is that without a major reorientation of India's growth model, land wars are going to be a long-term feature of India's democracy. And I would argue that we should not see them as obstructions to progress, but important checks on dispossession without development. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to OUP and Ashur for having me here. It's been a pleasure to see this and finally see Michael's book come to light. A book that is rich, that's nuanced, that teases out the complexity and the diversity and the difference, even within so local a unit as a village. When an intervention of the scale enters into your lives. And I think that's one of the really rich features of the book, which leads social scientists definitely, but also people at large to reconsider large, broad categorizations that we tend to make. When we say this is good for rural, this is good for urban, this is great for industry, great for labor, and things of that sort. And if I were to trivialize Michael's basic conclusion, it would be something like land in hand is better than jaw in the bush. And it's difficult for me to actually disagree with that. And in that sense, I think when we look at our development experience compared to China's, that's a large difference. Because in China in 1978 and 1980, when Deng starts his movement, the critical difference is every rural household is an owner of land, or essentially has access to land, and every urban household has access to housing. And that is not the case here. In the case of India, the question of opportunity and the ability to partake in this particular growth that would actually happen, and not much has happened. I mean, even if you look at the official numbers, 10 years after the SEZs were announced, we have officially an employment of about 1.4 million additional created. Most of that employment, some of that chunk, large chunk of that is with ITITES, and there is a bunch which is elsewhere. It also includes associated employment and not direct employment. But the structure, therefore, is even this employment is not entirely available, and even where it is available, it's not essentially accessible to the persons who are deprived of these positions for two reasons. One, as a number of them are not, quote unquote, endowed with the skills, or in other cases with the social capital, and this is one of the important things that Michael brings about, is the social capital to access these places. And the second is, as it's happening with one of the interesting lines in Michael's book, is about how the aspiration is for this salaried, regular salaried job. That's what you want to give up your land for, so to speak. And that regular salaried job is an increasingly small component of our employment landscape. So that said, while I agree with Michael's analysis, I find it difficult to agree with his prognosis. In fact, maybe a better way to put it would be that I refuse to sort of take in his prognosis, which is that the future of India is likely to be bleak, as that these opportunities will not be available to people who are being dispossessed of land, because the kind of jobs that will be available will be not the kind of jobs that these people will be prepared to take. And the reason I have a ray of hope there is fundamentally because the kind of people who are entering the workforce today are very different from the kind of people who entered the workforce 15 years ago. These people who are entering the workforce today are today much more educated, and in principle much more mobile. The question is whether the state will be able to provide the basic environmental conditions that will enable this workforce to sort of be offered these jobs wherever they are. And secondly, the more complicated portion is what kind of networks will these people have access to that will enable this person in Rajpura to access a job in Sri City, by SEZ in outside of Chennai, or in the booming sort of manufacturing zones in Pune, or wherever there is.
First of all, I want to congratulate Michael for what is really a very detailed piece of work, as Ashu pointed out. And I'm going to make 4 points. First, the title of the book. Dispossession without development gives the impression that all land acquisition has happened and no development has happened. I think you don't want to convey that impression. There has been development. It's been lopsided development, fine. Certain sections have benefited, certain sections have not benefited. Second, as Ashu pointed out, your entire book is based on the Rajpura model. It's a very successful, it's a successful model. It has had its successes. There have been some limitations. I would have been happier as a reader of the book and as somebody who has been involved in this area for quite some time, if you had had 1 or 2 other examples as well. Third, you use the word land wars. Land wars is a very, very extreme statement to make. And I have not seen land wars of the type that you are envisaging in your final chapter. Certainly land conflicts, certainly bitter opposition for land acquisition, it shouldn't be the case that we get away from reading your book saying that all of India is burning with land conflicts. That's not, strictly speaking, the case. It's particularly acute, as I said, central India. It's particularly acute where mining is involved, large-scale displacement is involved, multiple displacement is involved, and also where forest areas are involved. The fourth point I want to make is on, there's an elaborate discussion on states' intervention in land acquisition. Looking at it purely intellectually, what the 2013 law did, it had 4 pillars: compensation, consent, social impact assessment, and resettlement and rehabilitation. These were the 4 pillars of the 2013 law which were absent in the 1894 Act. Incidentally, one point that must figure in your last chapter is that the bulk of the land is acquired or has been acquired not under the Mega Land Acquisition Act, which occupies all the headlines and invites all attention, the 1894 Act or the 2013 Act, but under laws that are enacted separately. Projects, for example, land for coal mines, for example, is acquired under a separate law. Land for railways is acquired under a separate law. Land for power projects is acquired under a separate law. What has been the subject of political debate has been social impact assessment and consent. Now, there are different viewpoints, and I'm glad you have referred to the fact that there were different viewpoints in the process of formulating the law, and there was a very dominant view that was held by people of all political parties that land must not be acquired under any circumstances for private projects or for PPP projects. That, of course, was an extreme position which was not taken, and a window was created for acquisition of land for private and PPP projects. Article 254(1) of the Indian Constitution says that in a concurrent subject, if there is a central law and a state law, the central law will override the state law. That's 254(1). But in typical Indian fashion, we provided an escape route in 254(2). 254(2) says, if the state assembly passes provisions which are repugnant to the central law, it can submit those amendments to the president, and we all know what the president has to do. He has to just put his seal of approval.